Hey everyone, so a short video on our readings for the third week. So the going to be two videos. One concerns this problem of what happens when the spectator, one part of the spectator, right, what he calls the man without, what happens when it turns partisan, when it becomes partial, when it gets overtaken by bias. And that's obviously going to be very critical for the second part of the essay. But in this first video, I want to just talk about the impartial spectator. Now, and the composition, right? It has two parts. Now, I mentioned on the Moodle page that you can't trust the internet about lots of things, right? But especially, oddly enough, about the impartial spectator. The reason is because scholars have no consensus about what this concept is. The reason is that Smith says sort of different things about it. It's not always clear, but there are some, I think, guideposts, right, that we can try to understand. So the main thing is he calls it a demi-god. It's two parts. One is the very human part, and one is this sort of divine god-like part. And ideally they're coordinated, but sometimes they're not. And actually, what gets really interesting is that he thinks that if they're not coordinated, very, very frequently, it's the very human, fallible, unstable, biased part that actually kind of stuns and kind of occupies the driving seat of our moral compass, right? It sort of stuns the what he calls the man within, right? So the man within, he uses different. He says sometimes it's conscience. He uses the word reason. Now, what's quite clear is it's not reason in the sense of an algorithm, an axiom, a logical deduction, because what's really noticeable about these readings, right, is the strength of the moral terms that are used. So, you got the flesh and blood spectator. That's kind of what we met in the first readings, right? The spectator that surrounds you and I, that we're very familiar with. Colleagues at work, friends in the dorm, enemies in the dorm, family, professors for students, students for professors, right? You do evaluations and stuff like that with the professors, right? So, and I grade your essays, right? So there's a kind of a spectator concept, right? So that's the flesh and blood, right? What he calls the man without. And then you've got the man within. And he says that the principles of the two aspects of the spectator, the man without, its sort of operating code or principles, right, are praise and blame. But the man within, the absolute core of our moral compass is praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Then he says something that can get very tricky, right? And this is why I think there's often no real consensus about what he means. But but he says that, well, what's the sort of the how does one know about praiseworthiness? So, on one hand, he says, well, it's a natural moral sense. It's a natural sense, he says. But then he also says it's what you love and admire in others and what you hate and despise in others. So, just notice the strength of the moral language. But when he puts it into like, well, what you like and what you despise, or rather what you love and what you despise, this maybe gives you the impression, oh, well, conscience, that's kind of on me then, right? It's for me to kind of articulate what I think about right and wrong, good and evil. But it's quite clear from, especially of the three readings that I gave you, I only gave you 7 pages, right? But the three readings, there's those middle pages where what happens if you depart from the impartial spectator is that you will become the object of abhorrence, execration, you will be detestable, he says, right? In other words, right, you're going to be punished. So it can't be that, the spectator, the impartial spectator, is kind of like, well, what you personally think is right and wrong, right? Because otherwise, how do we explain this social punishment, right? So that's what the emphasis is, right? If you're not coordinated with the impartial spectator, assuming the impartial spectator is working, right? Because that's what these readings are about, right? The impartial spectator can be overwhelmed by the human part, and in the latter readings, what happens is he says that the spectator can sometimes be at so great a distance that it becomes ineffective. But if you are out of coordination with the impartial spectator, you will be subject to punishment, right? He says you will be this is what he says, the proper object of abhorrence. So you definitely, right, that's like becoming accursed or something, right? You don't want that, right? So so we know, right, that what the spectator, he tells us, right, and again in the middle pages, he tells us that what the spectator delivers to you and I is a real sense of our, how he puts it, littleness. And what he means by that is we have to understand that for you and I to be moral and to behave with propriety, we have to understand that whatever our desires are, others around us have desires. And he explicitly puts it in these terms, right? You cannot be moral if, for your advantage, you are willing to sacrifice others. And it's actually very interesting what he says about this, right? He says there's something incompatible with human dignity, right? So the kind of the moral story he wants to tell is that if you want to take yourself seriously, right, if you want to be a person of sort of principle, to stand on, to be a person of dignity, then it's not necessarily that you must sacrifice yourself for others, although it may come to that at certain moments, but certainly it can't be that you're happy or willing to sacrifice others for your advancement, right? That's definitely not okay. So this is this coordination model, right? That your interests and other interests, right, have got to be somehow coordinated. The impartial spectator does that, and if you're out of coordination, right, if your compass is all screwed up, then you're going to be the proper object of abhorrence, of real radical sort of accursedness. But the question is, how does the spectator, it's not that the spectator goes wrong, it's just that it has two components, right? It's a demigod. And the human part can fall into what's really explained in the latter pages, this extreme partiality, ideology, a kind of cult worship that can really screw with the coordination, right, of the various persons, right, who all have to take on a kind of littleness, right, so that they remain coordinated with one another. Since, of course, right, to have that sympathetic connection, Smith thinks, is absolutely basic, right, to human security. He'll often say, right, human security and tranquility, right, a certain calmness of mind, a certain being at peace with the world, right? Okay, so those are just some pointers. Read it, as I say. Don't listen to stuff on the internet. It can be very misleading. Just read it. Just try and just sit with it and think about it. Like, hey, what is he saying here, right? So I just try to give you a few little pointers so you kind of knew the sort of broad arc of what he's doing in these pages. But many of you have shown yourself really good at reading Smith, and I really look forward to seeing, that third exegesis, right? What you want to come up with. Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.